It was supposed to be just another summer evening in Cedar Grove, Texas, the kind where the thick scent of sunbaked grass hangs in the air and kids' laughter dances along the sidewalks. But for Emily Parker, that evening split her life cleanly in two. Before, there was cautious optimism. After, there was war. The first sign something was wrong came not from the shrill cries of playing children, but from the yawning silence of her front porch. Emily, fresh off a 14-hour nursing shift, pulled her battered sedan into the driveway and immediately sensed it, an emptiness that prickled the skin at the back of her neck. She slammed the car door and jogged up the front path, her heart pounding a syncopated rhythm of dread. Where the compact white medical fridge had once nestled discreetly under the shaded awning, there was now only a jagged outline of grime and bolts, and a door left swinging wildly on its hinges, like a wound torn open by reckless hands. Inside, it was gutted. No insulin pens. No emergency glucagon kits. No backup cooling packs. Only hollow space. Panic knifed through Emily's chest. She bolted into the house, calling for her son. Ethan? Ethan. She found him crumpled on the living room couch, his body limp, skin pale, mouth parted in shallow, rapid breaths. His cousin Lily, normally confident and quick-witted, stood frozen nearby, clutching Ethan's discarded tablet like a lifeline. He said he felt funny. Then he just started shaking, Lily whispered, tears brimming in her wide eyes. Emily dropped to her knees, instinct overriding terror. Ethan's pulse fluttered weakly beneath her fingers. His forehead burned with a sickly heat. She fumbled for her phone, her hands slick with sweat, and dialed 911, barking their address through a throat tight with fear. Type 1 diabetic, insulin missing, child unresponsive, hurry. Outside, the sky was streaked in watercolor shades of orange and pink. The neighborhood kids continued kicking their soccer balls, oblivious to the fact that a boy among them was slipping away just inside his own home. And then, as if the universe had not yet finished twisting the knife, Karen Whitfield appeared. Clad in her ever-crisp white blouse and khakis, clipboard tucked neatly under one arm like a soldier presenting a weapon, Karen ascended the porch steps with infuriating calm. "I took care of that appliance for you," she said, waving vaguely toward the empty spot where the fridge had once lived. Her voice was syrupy, almost patronizing. It violated HOA regulations. No external units visible from the street. "I'm sure you understand, Miss Parker." Emily's world narrowed to a pinpoint of incandescent rage and helplessness. She couldn't even form words. Her son was dying, and the woman responsible for dismantling his lifeline stood before her, smiling like she'd trimmed an unruly hedge. The ambulance screamed around the corner in a flash of red and sirens. Paramedics rushed past Karen without a second glance, zeroing in on Ethan's fragile form. Emily barely registered the whirlwind around her, IVs, oxygen, muttered vitals, as she kept her hand clamped around her son's tiny, clammy fingers, willing him to stay. By the time they reached Cedar Grove Memorial ER, Ethan's blood sugar had rocketed into a deadly stratosphere, his body teetering on the precipice of diabetic ketoacidosis. Machines blared warning after warning as doctors and nurses worked with desperate efficiency. Emily could do nothing but watch. A nurse gently pulled her aside after what felt like hours. "He's stable, for now," the woman said, her voice low but firm. "You got him here just in time." Just in time. 2 minutes later, and Ethan would have been another statistic. Another boy lost to a preventable tragedy. Another mother burying her child because someone else decided their property values mattered more than a human life. And as Emily stood by Ethan's bedside, tracing the pale, freckled skin on his wrist where the force snaked in, something inside her, something deep and long buried, woke up. She wasn't just a nurse anymore. She wasn't just a mother. She was a soldier. And she would burn the world to the ground before letting Karen Whitfield get away with it. The night was a hollow, endless thing. Emily sat in the stiff vinyl chair beside Ethan's hospital bed, her body aching, her mind a blur of images she couldn't push away. Ethan's trembling hands, Karen's cold smile, the gaping hole where the fridge had been. Outside the window, the city's lights flickered like dying stars, and somewhere deep inside her, a slow, relentless fury began to crystallize into purpose. She didn't go home when morning came. She didn't return to the neat little cul-de-sac where rules mattered more than breath. Instead, she drove straight to the Cedar Grove Police Department, her old sedan rumbling in defiance down streets lined with manicured hedges and American flags. Inside the station, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The air smelled of old coffee and paper. Emily stepped up to the front desk, ignoring the sideways glances at her disheveled scrubs and bloodshot eyes. "I need to file a criminal report," she said, voice steady but cold. The officer behind the glass partition blinked, startled. Ma'am, could you be more specific?" "Attempted murder." The word detonated in the small room, sucking the air from it. There was a beat of stunned silence before the officer, a heavy-set man with thinning hair, cleared his throat. "Maybe you mean vandalism? Property damage? If it's about the HOA, these things usually get handled privately, ma'am." Emily leaned in closer, her eyes like sharpened glass. "This isn't a dispute over flower beds or mailboxes," she hissed. "Karen Whitfield destroyed my son's insulin supply, his medical lifeline, and left him to die." The officer hesitated, then nodded slowly, pulling out a clipboard. His pen scratched across the paper, but Emily wasn't done. "You listen to me," she said, her voice trembling now, not with fear, but with the force of held-back grief. "This isn't about regulations. It's about a woman who decided her neighborhood's curb appeal mattered more than an 8-year-old boy's right to live. I won't let her bury this under some HOA handbook." The report was filed. Quietly, reluctantly, but it was filed. By evening, Karen Whitfield was served with a criminal summons. The notice fluttered like a white flag of surrender on her pristine front door, taped across the brass knocker she polished every Sunday. And for the first time in her life, Karen couldn't hide behind committee votes and passive-aggressive memos. For the first time, she was facing consequences. The news traveled faster than wildfire across Cedar Grove. At first, there were only whispers, private messages, nervous glances across front lawns. People scrolled through the HOA's private Facebook group and quietly deleted old posts, memes mocking the fridge, snide comments about special snowflake kids, and dramatic moms. Suddenly, no one had an opinion. Suddenly, everyone was neutral. Except for Emily. She stood her ground, not just in courtrooms, but in grocery stores, at gas stations, on sidewalks lined with brittle, polite smiles. People crossed the street when they saw her now. Some offered tight, guilty nods. Most just looked away. Silence had become its own kind of confession. The first court appearance was set for early autumn. Cedar Grove's downtown civic center, a drab beige monolith that smelled perpetually of mildew and disappointment, became the unlikely epicenter of a brewing storm. Karen arrived first, stepping from a gleaming black SUV, flanked by her high-powered attorney. She wore a navy pantsuit so sharply pressed it could have cut glass. Her pearl necklace gleamed like a noose around her neck. Her face, usually frozen into a smile of effortless superiority, was pulled taut over raw panic. Reporters thronged the courthouse steps, their cameras flashing like artillery. Inside, the seats filled with parents, nurses, local activists, and quiet, angry neighbors who had once mowed their lawns alongside Emily's without a second thought. They carried signs. "Insulin is not cosmetic. Children over codes. No life is an eyesore." For every second Karen kept her chin raised high. Every inch she tried to project invulnerability, the cracks in her armor widened. A bead of sweat trickled down her temple. She swallowed hard, once, twice. She was no longer the queen of manicured sidewalks. She was a defendant. In the dim light of the courtroom, the prosecutor clicked the remote. The grainy footage flickered to life on the monitor at the front of the room. Karen, in gardening gloves, striding across Emily's side yard like a conqueror. Karen, snipping the security cable. Karen, hauling the medical fridge to the street and dumping its contents with chilling nonchalance. Karen, spraying down the inside with a garden hose, the red medical labels flashing momentarily in the afternoon sun. There was a collective, audible inhale across the gallery. Even Karen's own attorney shifted uncomfortably. Karen shot to her feet, her voice cracking for the first time since the beginning. "I didn't know what it was. I thought it was junk." The prosecutor turned on her like a blade. "Did you think the medical cross symbol was decorative, Ms. Whitfield? Did the bright orange, emergency medical use only tape not catch your eye? Or did you simply not care?" The silence that followed was thunderous. The jury stared at her with the flat, heavy gaze reserved for those whose defense collapses not in a blaze of glory, but in the quiet shame of undeniable truth. Karen sat down, her face ashen. The narrative she had clung to, that she was merely upholding community standards, crumbled into dust at her feet. This wasn't about a fridge. This wasn't about rules. This was about reckless endangerment and attempted murder, and everyone knew it. Back in the gallery, Emily remained silent, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She just sat there, a mother made of steel, watching the woman who had gambled with her child's life lose everything she thought made her powerful. And in that stillness, in that unspeakable quiet, the entire courtroom understood one simple, devastating truth. Emily Parker hadn't just survived Cedar Grove's cruelty. She had conquered it. The courthouse consultation room smelled of cheap laminate and stale air conditioning. Emily sat at the battered metal table, her fingers absently tracing the peeling edge of a manila folder. Beside her, Ethan slept in a chair far too big for his small frame, bundled in a navy blue fleece blanket embroidered with tiny soccer balls. His 4 bruises peeked from under the sleeve of his shirt, purple and yellow reminders of how close she had come to losing him. Across from her, her attorney flipped through a stack of papers with meticulous precision. His brow furrowed as he spoke. "They want a deal," he said finally, setting the papers down. "Karen's attorney is offering a guilty plea to reckless endangerment and destruction of property. In exchange, they want the attempted murder charge dropped." Emily didn't move, didn't blink. Her hand hovered just above Ethan's, feeling the faint, reassuring warmth of his skin. "If we agree," her attorney continued, voice careful, "there'll be no lengthy trial. She'll serve probation, maybe community service. Some fines. No prison." The words rattled around in Emily's head like stones in a metal drum. Probation. Community service. For trying to kill her son. For treating his life like an aesthetic inconvenience. Her mind flashed back to that moment on the porch, Karen's clipboard, her painted-on smile, her careless dismissal as Ethan hovered on the brink of death. A child's life reduced to an eyesore. Emily inhaled slowly, the sterile air searing her lungs. "No," she said. Softly at first. Then again, louder, like the striking of a hammer. "No." The attorney nodded once, the corner of his mouth tightening in something that looked almost like pride. When the word traveled back to Karen's side, the reaction was immediate. Her attorney's carefully manicured expression faltered. Karen herself, watching from across the hallway, clutching the strap of her designer handbag so tightly her knuckles whitened, recoiled as if struck. The cameras caught it all, the twitch at the corner of her mouth, the panic rising behind her polished facade. There would be no quiet escape for her. No neat severance from her crimes. The second hearing was scheduled 2 weeks later. By then, the courthouse had become a battleground. Dozens of parents arrived in caravans, pushing strollers, holding signs, wearing T-shirts emblazoned with Ethan's freckled face beneath the words. "A life is not an inconvenience." Some carried empty insulin vials tied together with red ribbons, a chilling tribute to what had almost been lost. Others brought coolers, not full of protest materials, but of medical-grade supplies, symbolizing the quiet, essential lifelines so many families depended on and so few outsiders understood. And standing at the heart of it all was Emily. She didn't deliver speeches. She didn't shout into bullhorns. She simply stood, quiet and immovable, as a living monument to every parent who had ever been forced to defend their child's right to exist in a world obsessed with conformity. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was even heavier than before. The prosecution presented their final evidence, a series of photographs taken not just of the destroyed fridge, but of the storm drain behind Emily's house. Chemical tests revealed traces of destroyed insulin compounds, proof that Karen hadn't just removed the fridge. She had intentionally disposed of its contents, understanding, at some level, their medical importance. The judge, a stern woman with silver hair and piercing eyes, leaned forward on the bench. "Ms. Whitfield," she said, her voice slicing through the stale air, "you destroyed a labeled medical device and discarded life-saving medication during a heat wave, directly resulting in the hospitalization of a minor. Do you have anything to say before sentencing?" Karen rose slowly, visibly trembling. I didn't mean to," she began, but the words caught in her throat. A long, aching silence filled the room. Across the aisle, Emily watched without blinking, her face carved from stone. Karen's eyes darted around the room, seeking sympathy and finding only cold indifference. Even her own attorney stared at the floor. Karen tried again, voice cracking, "just trying to keep the neighborhood nice." The judge slammed her gavel down once, sharp and final. "This court finds you guilty of attempted destruction of life-preserving medical equipment, reckless endangerment, and criminal negligence with a special circumstance involving a minor. You are hereby sentenced to 3 years in state prison, a lifetime ban from any HOA leadership positions, and mandatory participation in psychological counseling. Karen's knees buckled slightly as the bailiffs approached. She didn't resist. She couldn't. Her power had evaporated the moment she treated a child's life like clutter on a lawn. The courtroom remained silent as she was led away, shackles clicking softly against the floor. No applause. No cheers. Just a collective exhale, a community, once complicit in silence, finally breathing again. Outside the courthouse, the air smelled different. It wasn't just the autumn wind or the fading sun. It was the scent of change. Parents hugged their children tighter. Neighbors, once strangers, shook hands and shared quiet nods of solidarity. The lawn signs multiplied overnight, staked into front yards like defiant little flags. We stand with families. Children over cosmetics. A fridge saved a life. Emily didn't start the movement. She didn't plan it. But she became its heart. And as she watched Ethan chase a soccer ball down their front sidewalk, his laugh loud and whole and real, she realized something profound. They hadn't just survived Cedar Grove. They had transformed it. The days that followed the sentencing passed like the slow unfurling of a long-held breath. Karen Whitfield's name disappeared from Cedar Grove's HOA records almost overnight, scrubbed from minutes, websites, and bylaws as if she had never existed at all. New leadership was elected in a hasty, unceremonious vote. No speeches, no champagne, just tired faces and the quiet understanding that the rules they had once worshipped needed to serve the people, not the other way around. For Emily Parker, there was no celebration, no victory laps, only the quiet work of healing. She returned to her modest home on Cottonwood Lane, the same house where she had once crouched by an empty porch wall, cradling her dying son in her arms. Now, a hand-carved wooden sign hung proudly beside the window. Here lives a mother who refused to let her son be sacrificed for silence. No one dared ask her to take it down. No one even suggested it. Instead, a ripple of change began to spread, subtle but unmistakable. Neighbors once too timid to meet her now waved openly. Some apologized, haltingly, awkwardly. Others couldn't find the words but left small tokens, a bouquet on her porch, a home-cooked meal left with no note but clear intent. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't forgiveness. But it was acknowledgement. And that mattered more. The real shift, though, came one chilly November afternoon as Emily sat at the kitchen table, bills and hospital forms fanned out before her like a battlefield map. She was circling numbers, biting the inside of her cheek in concentration, when her phone buzzed. It was a message from a woman she didn't know. "My son is type 1 too. We're fighting our HOA over his CGM receiver box. They say it's visual clutter. How did you do it? How did you make them listen?" Emily stared at the screen for a long time, her mind whirring. She thought of Ethan, of course, of his tiny freckled hands, his stubborn smile, his fight to live when the world had tried, however politely, to erase him. She thought of the signs sprouting on their street like defiant wildflowers. And she thought of every mother, every father, every exhausted parent who had been forced to beg for permission to keep their children alive. She put down her pen, opened her laptop, and began typing. The first version of the website was simple, almost crude. A plain white page with the name in bold navy letters. Ethan's Hope Foundation. Because no child's life should be considered an inconvenience. The mission was clear. Provide small grants for families to purchase medical-grade refrigeration units, glucose monitors, and backup insulin supplies. Offer legal resources for parents fighting restrictive HOA rules. Educate communities about the life-or-death realities behind the unsightly medical devices they so often sought to ban. Within weeks, emails began pouring in. First from Cedar Grove, then from across Texas, then from across the entire country. Parents who had been silenced, children who had been endangered, families who had fought alone and lost or barely survived. Each message carried its own heartbreak, its own quiet rage. "We were fined for installing a generator for my son's ventilator. They tried to evict us for building a wheelchair ramp. My daughter's insulin cooler was vandalized after the HOA sent a violation notice." Stories that, once hidden behind manicured hedges and closed doors, now flowed out like floodwater. And Emily answered them all. Late into the nights, while Ethan slept in the next room, she sat at her scarred kitchen table replying to every plea for help, every desperate question. She wasn't a politician. She wasn't an activist. She was a mother. And that was enough. By the time spring arrived, Ethan's Hope had provided over 400 grants across 8 states. Local businesses began sponsoring refrigeration units. Law students offered pro bono assistance drafting medical accommodation appeals. Nurses volunteered to host webinars on managing chronic illness within hostile communities. The foundation grew faster than Emily could have imagined, not because of marketing budgets or corporate endorsements, but because the need had always been there, waiting, unspoken, desperate. And everywhere she went, people recognized her. At grocery stores, at soccer games, at the post office. "You're Ethan's mom," they would say, sometimes with tears, sometimes with gratitude, always with respect. It wasn't fame. It wasn't attention. It was impact. Through it all, Ethan flourished. He grew taller, stronger, his once frail body filling out with the healthy sturdiness of a boy who had been given back his future. He learned to check his blood sugar himself, to carry backup insulin, to advocate when he needed help. And more than that, he played again. He laughed again. He lived. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops and the streetlights flickered on, Emily stood at the edge of their yard, watching Ethan kick a soccer ball against the curb with a small knot of neighborhood kids. He wore a silver medical alert necklace now, engraved with his name and condition. He wore it not as a mark of shame, but as a badge of survival. Above him, nailed to the side of their house just above where the fridge had once hung, the wooden sign caught the last of the sunlight. "Here lives a mother who refused to let her son be sacrificed for silence." Emily smiled, not broadly, but enough. Enough to know that while the scars remained, they no longer defined them. They had built something stronger in their place. Hope. Community. Change. Not because they had asked permission. Not because they had waited for validation. But because they had chosen fiercely, stubbornly to live. To fight. To endure. And because one boy's life had proven that no law, no HOA rule, no polite societal indifference could ever define the worth of a single human soul. It didn't end in Cedar Grove. The ripples spread outward, far beyond the cracked sidewalks and perfectly trimmed hedges where it had all begun. Like a stone cast into still water, the impact of Emily Parker's stand radiated into communities that had never even heard of Cottonwood Lane, but recognized, all too well, the quiet violence of being told that survival was unsightly. It started small. One by one, HOAs across Texas began rewriting their covenants. Tiny amendments slipped into their handbooks. Reasonable accommodations shall be made for visible medical equipment deemed essential to health and safety. Simple. Barely a paragraph. But monumental. Then came the school boards, the city councils, the homeowner seminars in suburban strip malls. Discussions once monopolized by arguments over grass length and fence paint turned, however awkwardly, toward conversations about human dignity, about compassion, about the cost of conformity when it strangles the lives it claims to protect. Some resisted, of course. There were always those who grumbled about slippery slopes and personal responsibility, who whispered behind closed doors about property values and neighborhood prestige. But their voices were no longer unchallenged. They were met by parents holding framed photos of children lost too soon, by neighbors who refused to look away a second time, by communities that had learned painfully, permanently, that aesthetics could never again be allowed to outweigh humanity. And everywhere, threaded through news articles, podcasts, and town hall meetings, a single name kept surfacing. Ethan's hope. The foundation that had begun with one grieving, furious mother sitting at her kitchen table now stretched across 12 states. It offered not just grants, but legal templates, emergency response kits, seminars for HOA boards on ADA compliance and ethical governance. Emily never set out to be a crusader. She never sought a podium, never aspired to interviews or headlines. But when the first national journalist arrived in Cedar Grove, camera crew in tow, and asked if she would speak, she said yes, not for herself, but for every parent still fighting in the shadows. Standing before the camera, with Ethan perched shyly beside her, Emily said simply, "No child should have to beg for the right to survive, and no community should ever again make survival a violation." It wasn't fiery. It wasn't dramatic. It was steady. It was real. And it was enough to catch fire. Months later, a resolution was introduced in the Texas state legislature, the Medical Accommodations Fairness Act. It proposed statewide protections for visible medical devices on private property, overriding HOA restrictions that endangered lives under the guise of visual harmony. The bill's unofficial nickname, whispered in the halls of the Capitol and shouted proudly at rallies, was simple: Ethan's Law. When it passed, not unanimously, but overwhelmingly, the room erupted into applause not for politicians, but for the countless unseen families who had carried similar burdens for years. Emily and Ethan watched the announcement live from their living room, the flickering television casting a pale glow across the walls. Ethan, 9 years old now, taller, stronger, still proudly wearing his silver medical necklace, turned to her and grinned. "Did we really do that, Mom?" Emily ruffled his hair, her throat tightening. "No," she said softly. "You did." Years later, long after Cedar Grove had become a footnote in a larger story, new generations would grow up in neighborhoods with ramps, with medical coolers tucked discreetly under awnings, with glucose monitors clipped to children's belts like badges of quiet resilience. And when people asked where it all began, they would find the answer in a simple, weather-worn plaque outside a small community center, surrounded by a garden of wildflowers and hardy oak trees. It read, "In honor of Ethan Parker, whose life proved that dignity is not negotiable, and that hope, once planted, grows roots deeper than fear." Because in the end, it wasn't about one HOA. It wasn't about one lawsuit, or one punishment, or one outrage. It was about the truth that Emily Parker had carved into the world with every sleepless night, every whispered prayer, every battle fought with nothing but love and ferocity. Some things are worth fighting for. Some lives are too precious to compromise. And sometimes, it only takes one voice refusing to be silenced to change everything.